Chapter 7 opens with her saying that women's need for birth control wasn't actually about bodily autonomy, but was just purely eugenics. Just as we saw most feminists in the 19th century involved in spiritualism, in the 20th century we see most feminists involved with eugenics, abortion, and birth control. One of those things is not like the others. Now, it is true that there was a small fringe group of feminists known as eugenic feminists, but they basically disappeared after around 1930 as they started to disagree more and more with actual eugenicists. Feminists being into eugenics, though, today and throughout the rest of the 20th century, not very common at all. Rachel goes on, however, to bring up Margaret Sanger, because if she had one negative view, that means that everything she ever did was bad. Because again, who needs nuance? Who needs to actually understand the entire social context of something? Margaret Sanger is someone I've spoken about in videos before because she is such a complex character who had some good ideas, some bad ideas, and we can understand all of that and be as equally critical of her as we can acknowledge the good work she did. It's important to understand that not everyone is entirely evil or entirely good. Rachel says of Margaret Sanger's childhood, they also try to overplay the hardships of Sanger coming from a large family, which seems so foreign to us today, but was not at all uncommon at the time. Margaret Sanger certainly did have a negative view of being the middle child of a large family, but of course there are a great many people from such families who don't see it that way at all. My great-grandfather was one of 14 children, none of whom counted this as a burden as far as I know. This is quite obviously a matter of perspective, but in feminist academia, it is always portrayed as a negative and a hardship, mostly in order to justify abortion. Right? It's almost as though different people have different experiences, and that different experiences are actually valid. Crazy, right? It's almost like different people want different amounts of children and should be able to choose for themselves how many they have. For her to say like, oh, well, Margaret had a negative view, but that doesn't even count. My family didn't, and that's what counts. It's just so damn ridiculous. How is this not an argument for the legalization of abortion and birth control and a woman's right to choose? Because you can see that big families are great for some and bad for others. Ugh. Margaret herself said in her autobiography about her childhood, Christmases were on the poverty line. If any of us needed a new winter overcoat or a pair of overshoes, these constituted our presents. I was the youngest of 6, but after me, others kept coming until we were 11. Our dolls were babies, living, wriggling bodies to bathe and dress instead of lifeless faces that never cried or slept. We had little time for recreation. School was 5 miles away and we had to walk back and forth twice a day as well as perform household duties. The boys milked the cow, tended the chickens, took care of Tom, the old white horse, which pulled our sleigh up and down the hill. The girls helped put the younger children to bed, mended clothes, set the table, cleaned vegetables, and washed the dishes. There's many more stories of her childhood in that book, and she says she would never want to go back and live like that again. So why not listen to her? Why not listen to the other women and children who don't want to live like that? Why not give them a choice? It's, wild. Rachel goes on to write, one of Sanger's most famous quotes is, no woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. But something most people don't know at the time, and many still don't know today, is that Sanger likely fabricated her most famous personal account of tending to a patient suffering the effects of a botched, self-induced abortion during this time in an apparent effort to propagandize the subject. She really needs to learn how to use commas. She often publicly told the story of a woman she treated in her nursing days who died after 2 attempts at abortion, named Sadie Sachs. Sanger biographer Ellen Chasler made an effort to corroborate the story and found no evidence of Sanger ever having met or treated such a person. She couldn't find any record that the patient even existed, which should be possible given the very detailed account, including the general time and place. Other fans of Sanger have tried to find evidence supporting Sanger's tale and failed. Therefore, it is accepted among several Sanger biographers that Sanger made this up and possibly other similar stories to propagandize the issue. And you know what? Yeah, it's very common for people like writing stories like this with the goal to educate the public, to change the names of patients, or combine the stories of multiple patients together to protect their anonymity while still raising awareness of the issue. So I don't have an issue with this, because here's the thing, even if Sadie Sachs wasn't real, this was a real story that happened to so many thousands of women. We know it did happen, and often we know that even if this one particular story wasn't real, it was happening again and again and again to other women. There's multiple articles about it in journals like The Lancet. There's stories about it in newspapers and women's magazines and old diary entries and all sorts. And you know what? It still happens today. All around the world, millions of women are dying from either illegal abortions or not being able to get access to legal abortions when they need one. Even if Sadie Sachs wasn't real, she's just simply a figurehead for the millions of women that this did happen to. So I don't have an issue with this at all. She says, at this point in my research on feminism, I had already noticed a distinct pattern of lies, forgery, and fraud. Given this, I wondered just how many of the dramatic assertions from feminists about the proliferation of back alley abortions were true, and how many were fear-mongering abortion propaganda. Oh my god. Are you actually kidding me? So now, not only is she, like earlier in the book, she's like pro-witch trials and murdering women, and now she's like, back alley abortions weren't even real, I don't believe in them. Can't just discount the millions of women who've died this way because, I don't know, it's kind of convenient for me to not believe it.
Hey, so editing me again, and I'm just going to jump in here with an actual example for you, because I wanted to read you a few passages from a book by an actual midwife. So Jennifer Worth was a midwife in London in the 1950s and onwards, and she actually wrote a number of memoirs about her work, one of which ended up being the basis for the drama TV series on the BBC called Call the Midwife. But her memoirs, while Call the Midwife is kind of like a fictional adaptation of her books were memoirs. They really happened. These were her real experiences and the experiences of her colleagues and the people she worked with. So in one of her books called Farewell to the East End, and you'll have to excuse me because I'm reading off my screen up above me, she has a couple of chapters about illegal abortions in the UK, specifically around London, and people that she worked with and spoke to. And in these, she writes of a woman called Hilda seeking an abortion because the thought of a seventh baby in that horrible flat filled her with such dismay that she thought anything would be better. Jenny goes on to write, she had to be very careful. Backstreet abortions were quite common in those days, but the practice was illegal, and both the client and the abortionist could be prosecuted if caught and would face a prison sentence if convicted. Every precaution was necessary. So the abortionist that Jenny writes about in this particular story was a woman called Mrs. Pritchard, and she talks about the actual process of the abortion, saying, to the police, local doctors, church and social workers, Mrs. Pritchard was a herbalist specialising in potions known only to the mystics for the cure of hay fever, gout, arthritic knees, and so on. Her front room was filled with bottles and phials. Her premises had been inspected several times by the public health authorities, who had found her remedies and treatments to be harmless, if ineffectual. Evidence of the more lucrative side of her business was nowhere to be seen. She'd learned her trade from her mother, who had been an abortionist since the 1880s, and when the old lady died, Mrs. Pritchard had inherited the equipment which had been stolen from hospital about 50 years earlier. So because everything was completely illegal, these instruments were very old, they were really hard to clean, they were never stored in sanitary conditions because they had to be hidden away. So in this case, Mrs. Pritchard takes her abortion equipment with her. Mrs. Pritchard has taken the abortion equipment with her in literally a bag of vegetables, dirty vegetables. And Jenny wrote, Mrs. Pritchard delved among the leeks and Brussels tops and produced her instruments. They were exceedingly old and made of rough, unpolished steel, virtually impossible to sterilise, if indeed Mrs. Pritchard ever made any attempts at sterilisation. They consisted of a few ancient surgical instruments such as forceps, dilators, curettes, and a Higginson's syringe. Then there is an incredibly graphic description of what an illegal, unsafe abortion entailed. And I'm going to warn you now, this is going to be very hard to listen to, so feel free to skip ahead to the end of this section if you need to. But if you can, I want you to listen to it, because this will help you understand why these abortions were so much more dangerous than safe, legal abortions in a proper hospital or care facility are today. This is not what the average abortion today is like. I just want to make that very clear. I'm telling you the story not to demonise abortion in general, but to help you understand why we need it to be legal and safe and clean and so on. She felt with her fingers until she thought she'd located the cervix. With the forceps, she grabbed the cervix and pulled it towards her. Hilda felt a pain like a knife stabbing her body, but she managed to suppress a scream. Holding the cervix quite firmly, Mrs. Pritchard took one of the dilators and attempted to force it through the closed cervix with no success. Too big, muttered the abortionist, and reached for a smaller dilator, which she pushed hard against the cervical orifice. Hilda felt pain like burning knives tearing her body apart. She opened her mouth to scream, but a towel was thrust in, pushing her tongue backwards and nearly choking her. Mrs. Pritchard had a curette at her disposal, so she poked with it in a blind attempt to force entry through the cervix into the uterus. When she thought she'd succeeded, she started scraping around and continued scraping until blood began to flow. The pain was so intense that Hilda passed out, and when she regained consciousness, she was vomiting, but the towel had been thrust into her mouth and was still there, so she started choking. The abortionist said, "There now, a nice flow of blood. That's all you needed, dear. A nice new broom to sweep away them stomach cramps. You'll be all right now, dear. You might feel shaky for a day or two, but it'll soon pass, and you'll be fine. Now get up, dear. Yes, you can get up all right and go and lie on the bed for an hour or two. We'll do the cleaning up. It's all part of the service. I pride myself on never leaving a mess behind." So again, I just want to make it clear, this is not what an abortion today is like, or rather, this is not what a legal, safe abortion is like. There are still, sadly, illegal abortions being carried out, and they are barbaric, they are dangerous, because if they're illegal and they have to be done in secret, they're never going to be completely sterile or safe or done by people who are trained to do it safely. In the next chapter, Jenny talks more broadly about backstreet abortions, and she says, and this is where I'm going to be doing a lot of reading to you again, but I think it's important that you get this perspective from someone who worked in this field and dealt with a lot of actual women who went through this. She says, "There have always been women who wanted or needed an abortion. For rich women, it was relatively easy. A clandestine visit to a secret address, often abroad, where a doctor working in an unregistered clinic would operate illegally and usually successfully, leaving little damage to the woman. Sometimes it's possible to procure an abortion legally if two doctors, one a psychiatrist, would testify that the woman seeking the abortion was mentally and physically incapable of carrying the pregnancy to full term. It cost a lot of money, but the risk of prosecution was removed. For poor women, it was a different story. Most working-class people lived in a perpetual state of poverty. The whole family crowded into 1, 2, or at most 3 rooms, with not enough food, lighting, or heating. Contraception was inadequate, and women had too many children, far more than they could decently house or feed. Another baby was frequently a disaster. For single women, pregnancy was a catastrophe, and many preferred suicide to the stigma of bearing an illegitimate child. So, millions of women sought an abortion. The first method attempted was usually a simple vaginal douche, but this was unlikely to work because the fluid has to enter the uterus to be effective. If a caustic solution was used, it caused chemical burns to the vagina and cervix. She goes on to write, "Thousands of women tried medicinal ways of evacuating the uterus. Violent purgatives such as a pint of Epsom salts were used. Gin and ginger, turpentine, raw spirit, aloes and sloes were also employed. None of them worked. Disreputable newspapers and journals advertised what they called cures for menstrual blockage for a sum of money. These were poisonous and sometimes fatal. Quinine was commonly used, and some cures even contained arsenic or mercury. Wise women have known for millennia that the black fungal growth on rye grain will induce an abortion. It was called ergo, and was also known to cause the deadly disease commonly called St. Anthony's fire. When I was a young pupil midwife doing my theoretical training at a teaching hospital, a colleague was having an affair with a doctor and she became pregnant. She stole a bottle of ergometrine from the ward medicine cupboard and took the tablets over a period of days until she aborted. She became terribly ill, but such was her desperation that she continued working throughout. If matron had discovered that she was pregnant, my colleague would have been dismissed. If it had come to light she'd been stealing ergometrine, her name would have been removed from the register. She was an SRN, and very likely reported to the police for prosecution under the Criminal Abortion Act." And that's not the only story either. Again, Jenny goes on to tell more stories of more women. Some women tried violent methods such as falling downstairs or half drowning or taking a scalding hot bath in the hopes that they would provoke a spontaneous miscarriage. If the woman survived, she would usually still be pregnant because one would virtually have to kill the mother before the fetus could be destroyed. Driven to extremes by despair, women would go to unbelievable lengths in trying to make themselves miscarry. Knitting needles, crochet hooks, metal coat hangers, paper knives, pickle spoons, curved upholstery needles, spokes of bicycle wheels have all been forced into the uterus by desperate women who prefer to do anything rather than continue the pregnancy. And I'll remind you, Jenny is writing about this from experience. These are things that she has seen women do to themselves. These are things that her colleagues have seen women do to themselves. These aren't just propaganda for the sake of it. These are actual stories of actual women who have put themselves through this because they didn't have any other option. Jenny goes on to write, "I've given talks to women's groups on the early days of midwifery. In the course of many of these talks, some lady in the audience has told us a story about a grandmother or great aunt who had induced an abortion on herself. I've heard many such stories and in diverse circumstances, and they are all so dismally similar that the oral evidence cannot be in doubt, she writes. One story related by a lady at a WI meeting will suffice. My aunt was a respectable single woman of 35 living with her mother, who was very proud of the family reputation. While on holiday, my aunt became pregnant and tried to abort herself with a crochet hook. She bled profusely, and her mother found out what was going on. The old lady was so horrified at what the neighbours might say that at first she refused to call the doctor. It was not until it became obvious that her daughter would die that in great secrecy she summoned a doctor who performed an evacuation of the uterus and suturing on the kitchen table of their home. Afterwards he said, "This must not go beyond the walls of this house. No one but we three will know what has happened tonight." The story was not told in the family for 40 years. That doctor had saved the woman's life, but he had risked his career in doing so. Had the story become known and his name reported to the General Medical Council, he would have been brought up before a disciplinary committee for professional misconduct. I don't understand how Rachel can hear stories like this of actual people who have been through this and their family members have been through this and still suggest that none of it actually really happened. It's all just fake. Like, does this not break your heart? I'm gonna go on, there's more to read. Jenny writes, the alternative to attempting to make oneself miscarry was to visit an illegal abortionist, like we saw in the last chapter. Backstreet abortionists favoured one of two methods, the surgical procedure or the flushing out method. Both are highly dangerous and only a doctor trained in surgery is competent to conduct an abortion. However, that did not stop countless numbers of women practising for a fee. They had a vague idea of female anatomy and operated with improvised instruments such as those described, or with obsolete instruments stolen from a hospital, like in the last chapter. There was no sterility, no anaesthetic, no proper lighting, and operations frequently took place on kitchen tables. It's easy to push a metal object into the vagina, but the cervix lies at a nearly 90-degree angle to the vaginal wall. Without surgical knowledge, the instruments could easily miss the cervix and go straight through the vaginal wall. Working blind, abortionists had been known to push a sharp object into the bladder or rectum. If the instrument did enter the uterus, it was sometimes pushed right through and out the other side. Even if these hazards were avoided, bleeding was frequently uncontrollable. And again, she goes on to tell another story. A talk I gave to the East London History Society in 2006. Oh, and again, I'm going to say that, look, 2006. So this isn't crazy propaganda because it's already legal at this, well, not quite as legal as it might be, but it's already legal at this point. So this isn't fictional propaganda. This is just a genuine story. So, 2006. A woman in the audience told us that in the 1930s, in the small Essex village where she was born, there was a bona fide midwife who was also an abortionist. She was a good practitioner, experienced and respected. A mother in the village came to her and said that her 14-year-old daughter was pregnant and begged her to carry out an abortion. The woman did not want to, but the mother pleaded so earnestly that eventually she agreed. The flushing out method was used, and the girl died on the table. Mother and abortionist were sent to prison. Again, are we to believe that she's just making this story up as well, even though in 2006 she has absolutely no reason to? Do we suppose she faked criminal records to go along with it? Is that what Rachel thinks? It's insane. She says of her own experience, as nurses and midwives, we often had to clear up the mess after a bungled abortion, especially when we worked on gynecological wards. The outcome for these women was frequently chronic ill health. Conditions such as anemia, scar tissue with adhesions, prolapse with chronic pain, incontinence, cystitis or nephritis could be expected along with many others. Thrombosis of the leg was not uncommon, and this clot could travel into the bloodstream lodging in the lungs. Anticoagulants were not available until the 1950s. I've seen much mutilation and 2 deaths. The first was of a girl of 19 whose internal mucosa and cervix had been burned by a carbolic acid or some other caustic solution used during a flushing out abortion. There was little we could do and she lingered for a while, but she was in constant agony and died after a few days. I recall another tragic woman, the mother of 5, developed a massive sac of pus in the peritoneum after a surgical abortion. We tried to drain it without success, and for many weeks pus oozed from her abdomen. The 5 children coming into hospital just before their mother died can never be forgotten. Jenny ends this chapter by writing that the Criminal Abortion Act of 1803 was repealed in 1967. Knowing that I'd been a midwife, I was sometimes asked if I approved or not. My reply was that I did not regard this as a moral issue, but as a medical one. A minority of women will always want an abortion, therefore it must be done properly. And I really respect that she ended on that, because I think it's such an important thing to remember. It's not a moral issue, it's a medical issue. This is medical care that women and people with uteruses will always need. Whether you want to have an abortion or not is a personal choice, but there should always be an option for it to be done legally and safely and affordably. Yeah, so I don't know, I felt like while I was editing this video, I realised that I hadn't really told any real stories or read anything out from people who'd actually like experienced this or worked with these women, and I felt it was important to share, because if Rachel's making these big claims about how, oh, these people are all just making it up, it's not real, I felt the need to actually respond to that and be like, well, actually, no, it is very real. Here's some real stories. How can your heart not go out to these women, you know? Anyway, thanks for listening to me while I'm all messy like this.
Like, the World Health Organization found that 45% of the 73 million abortions which happen worldwide every year are unsafe. Over 7 million people in developing countries alone were hospitalized due to complications from unsafe abortions in 2012, and the mortality rates due to unsafe abortions were at least 200 per 100,000 abortions, although it's believed this figure is actually a lot higher. As the World Health Organization states, maternal deaths due to abortion, and more specifically unsafe abortion, are often misclassified and underreported given the stigma. That is millions of women becoming ill and dying because of unsafe abortions today. Imagine how many it was back then when it was illegal in way more places. Do they really think we're just making up all these dead women for the lols? No, they're real and they matter. And even if it wasn't in the millions, even if it was just a few thousand or hundred, or like, their deaths would still matter, because we can prevent them, and we should. And while we don't have the exact stats for the numbers of arrests and convictions of people having and performing illegal abortions in the early 1900s and before, we do have records of at least some of them, and we know that they did happen. We know that women died. We know that doctors and midwives were convicted of causing the deaths of both fetuses and mothers. We know this is a fact. And yet Rachel still goes on to claim abortion rights activists have indeed been engaged in falsifying and exaggerating a great deal of facts and figures about abortion prior to Roe v. Wade, if not imagining them altogether. The often repeated trope about the desperate woman seeking back alley abortions performed by unskilled, untrained hacks is false. Before abortion was made legal in 1973, 90% of abortions were performed by physicians, and almost all the rest were performed by midwives. Yeah, and a lot of them were arrested for it. Just saying.